Are they still muted?
Yes, they are.
Wait.
Yes. Hello.
Okay.
You guys are muted.
Hi.
There you are. There you are.
Yeah. Hi, sorry. I was introducing our guests. None of you, as it happens, are guests, although Gary's empty chair reminds us that Gary's in Florida, where we all wish we were right now, maybe. Okay, some of us, except Charlie. I'm going to do the Rotary Minute and the inspiration today. They're the same subject. Who here knows about shelter boxes? Shelter Box. Shelter Box is a company that was originally started by Rotarians, and then it broke off and became a separate company. Shelter Box, this is what they believe. Everyone deserves a place to call home. It is a human right and the first step towards recovery from disaster. Shelter is so much more than just a roof. It's the foundation of life, families, and communities. When you don't have to keep moving or worry about where to sleep at night or tomorrow, your life is good. Their mission is to build awareness of global displacement and to facilitate providing families with life-saving shelter and essential tools and supplies that will enable them to rebuild their homes and transform their lives after disaster. Shelter Box supplies kits. They have tent kits, shelter kits, which include shovels, hammers, tarps, other equipment, solar lights, cooking sets, water filters, mosquito nets, and blankets, all in, separate kits. So now I'm going to read you an email that was sent to our district and passed on to the club presidents. Shelter Box is responding after a series of powerful earthquakes devastated southern Turkey and northern Syria. We're sending an emergency response team to carry out crucial assessments and establish how we can best help. Shelter Box is launching an emergency fundraising appeal. Your support will contribute to our Turkey and Syria earthquakes response as part of our general fund. We believe that is the best way for us to be impactful. We believe that the best way for us to be impactful is by staying flexible, and it is essential that we have funds available to support those affected by disasters around the world. We're speaking with our existing partners in Syria and Rotary contacts in Turkey to understand more about what's needed and how we might provide support where it is needed most. In the next paragraph, he talks about how many have died. This was a few days ago. I think there are over 14,000 now.
17.
17?
17, yeah.
Yeah. Head of emergency response for Shelter Box, Alice Jefferson, says, emergency responses to a disaster of this scale can be a huge logistical nightmare, especially against the clock. Freezing temperatures and heavy rain are causing extra complications. The poor weather poses a real threat to life for people whose homes are now rubble or unsafe to return to. Access and communication are challenging, and that's why responses must be well coordinated to make sure that the right aid is getting to the right people in the right place at the right time. Club and district support is desperately needed so we can reach survivors in the aftermath of this disaster. Please share this with all clubs in District 7850, which is our district. So in case any of you have been watching the news and feel like you want to do something, I would recommend shelterboxusa.org.
Sally,
Yes.
any thought about maybe asking people to donate as a club, all as a single unit?
Sure. What we could do is pass the hat today, and then the board could vote on whether we match the donations. So while you're all eating, and I'm gonna ask Eric a favor in a minute, and then we'll pass the hat. And speaking of Eric, yes.
When you pass the hat, get little pieces of paper to put like, because a lot of us might not have cash with us today, not knowing we were gonna pass the hat.
Sure.
And put whatever we are gonna donate.
Sure. Good thought. Hold on. I can.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. That's right. You know, I brought was half dozen eggs, but I'm thinking that might not make you one.
Might not make it. And so speaking of Eric, would you come up here? So I'm introducing our newest member of the club. Eric Barbic is the manager of the NBT Bank here at Taft's Corners. And I have decided that rather than try to tell you about Eric, you have to do two things. One, ask him yourself. And two, we're going to have classification talks in March. Now, Aaron knows what they are. Jen doesn't know. You probably know. Do you remember classification talks?
I do.
Yeah. A person gives a classification talk and tells about their background. And so that's when you're going to have a chance to really get to know Eric. So Eric, I would like to welcome you to the Williston-Richmond Rotary Club as our newest member. Welcome.
Thank you.
And can I borrow your hat?
What?
Can I borrow your hat to pass it?
Yes, absolutely.
So this is the hat we'll be passing. Yes. Who doesn't, right? Okay, we'll start with Terry, and you can pass the pen and paper around.
If you don't have.
So I have one shameless commerce ad to give you. I don't know if any of you have read Greg Marino's post about the penguin plunge, which got canceled, thankfully, because it was 35 degrees below zero. So at Williston Central School, they're going to have what's called the ice water bucket dump this Saturday at 9 o'clock in the morning. Yes,
Greg is still raising money.
that's my next statement. And so if any of you are interested in supporting Greg, because he says he's going to let them dump ice water on him, I think that'll be interesting to watch at 9 o'clock Saturday morning at the school.
To raise $1,000.
Right? And he's up to, I think, over 500. Anyway, so Greg is a member of the club. For those of you who don't know Greg, he is the head principal of the two schools. And it would be a lot of fun to watch him getting ice water dumped on him. The next thing I want to bring up is our blood drive, March 4th from 10 to 3. How many people here know their blood type?
Well, the A+ I ever got in my.
Well, so if you know your blood type, you probably have given blood before. If you don't know your blood type, you can find out by giving blood at the Red Cross. And if you can't give for health reasons or other reasons, you must surely know somebody who can. So I would say, please start promoting our blood drive on March 4th. I went on and signed my husband and I up, and there were 44 spaces, which means nobody else was signed up. You had said that, and I thought that it would be 42 spots, but it was 44. Anyway, please sign up for March 4th. Go to redcross.org, and it's very easy to sign up to donate. Now, having said that, if you can't give on March 4th, there's actually a very big blood donation this Saturday sponsored, in honor of Addie Carroll. I don't know if you all know the little girl that died last year from a blood cancer. She was in the news a lot. They're trying to get people to give this Saturday in Addie's name. So if you can't give on March 4th, number one, we'll forgive you. And number two, you could give this Saturday in Essex. I don't know the exact location. And I think that's all my news. So, yes, Armand?
I'm just curious if anybody at home wants to make an IOU donation for the hat.
Right. If any of you at home want to make a donation to the shelter box donation that we will make, please just send me an email and tell me, and that'll be sufficient. Also, the members of the 5K team are going to meet right after the meeting today at 1 o'clock. Okay. Any other news anybody wants to do? If not, I'm going to let Debbie introduce our speaker.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I'm not with you in person, folks. I've been sick since Monday, and testing negative for COVID every day. My niece makes me test every day, but I still feel really lousy. So didn't want to give you what I have. And I'm sorry not to see you in person, Tim. But thanks for being here. And Tim characteristically sent me a very short and modest bio, but I expanded a little bit on his bio. So so allow me to introduce him. Tim was born in Framingham, Massachusetts, and holds degrees from the University of. Yeah, the very beginning. That's right. Yes, you were. I'm sure you were a very cute little baby. Right. He holds degrees. So what's that?
Colicky. I'm sorry to say.
Colicky.
It's not in my bio anywhere.
Right. It's because you're a progressive, but that's okay. Okay, he holds degrees from the University of Vermont and Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. He served on the staff of then Congressman Bernie Sanders in between his 2 degrees. After that, for 8 years, Tim developed affordable housing for seniors and individuals with special needs with Cathedral Square. He served 2 terms on the Burlington City Council, chairing the city's Community Development and Neighborhood Revitalization Committee. Tim was elected to represent Chittenden County in the Vermont State Senate in 2008 and served in that August body until 2021. And I know that it is August because I served also in that with him. He served quite a lot longer than I did. But during his long tenure, he served on the Appropriations Committee and chaired the Finance Committee and served on quite a number of other committees. And then his highest leadership role was serving for 4 years as the president pro tem of the Senate. And during that time, Tim led the Senate to pass landmark gun safety legislation, groundbreaking transportation and climate change bills, and the 2 constitutional amendments that just completed the process on abolishing slavery and ensuring reproductive rights. He was appointed Deputy State Auditor by Auditor Doug Hoffer in April 2021. And this is the job that he is going to speak to us about today. I also know that Tim is a cat lover, because all the best people are, and a big soccer fan, especially of the inimitable Argentinian player Leo Messi. Vermont is fortunate to have had Tim in a number of leadership roles, and we are fortunate to hear from him today. So please help me welcome Tim Ashe.
Well, thank you. And Debbie not only knows that I'm a huge soccer fan, but on her travels has come back with a Leo Messi jersey from her travels to South America, which I still wear frequently whenever I watch Leo Messi play for club or country. So I'm not going to do a slide thing up there just because I hope to be able to dazzle you with my remarks about auditing. But I'm going to give you a quick snapshot just of what the auditor's office does, a question frequently asked of us. And then I'll give you kind of greatest hits of the last couple of years of some of the audits with just some of the what I think are more interesting findings that we've had from our reports. So short story is the auditor's office is fairly small, 16 people. About 12 of them are sort of official certified auditors. So everything that they do lacks editorial commentary. It's merely they look to investigate whether the facts are as they should be, whether money has been spent appropriately, or programs are being administered the way they're supposed to by state law. So oftentimes my boss, Doug Hoffer, will be in the news and he's speaking sort of extemporaneously and maybe taking some verbal liberties about particular programs. But the work that backs that up is always very independent and objective, and it's been produced by a team of state employees who do not have partisan influences when they're doing their work. There are really 3 key things that the auditor's office does. The one that most people suspect it does exclusively is audits the state's finances. So there are really 2 pieces. One is by federal law, we are required to determine whether all federal funds have been used appropriately. That's called the state's single audit. And then the other is the audit of the state's financials. That is called the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, the ACFR. The second thing we do is what's most interesting to Doug, what's most interesting to me, and what you usually see in the news from our office. These are called performance audits. That's where we say, here's a government program. Are they using your money wisely? Is it delivering the results for Vermonters that people had intended when the program was established? And I'm going to walk through a bunch of examples of that. And then lastly, we provide what we believe are deeply researched policy briefs and issue reports to try to help inform policymakers as they're making budget decisions or programmatic decisions. One of the things Debbie hoped I would just quickly touch on, so I'll just say it right out of the gates, is what are the enforcement mechanisms? So we do these financial audits, we do these performance audits of programs, we come up with recommendations. What is our ability to actually make sure that either the governor and his team or the legislature actually does what we say? There really are three. We don't have badges. We don't go around and arrest people, although some states have auditors that do that, and they love talking about it. The first is persuasion. We say, here's this program. It's not being done very well. If you make these changes, it'll be better for everybody. We wish that was easier. It's not so easy in a political environment. The second is financial pain. When there are audit findings that suggest that there are not good controls to make sure money is being spent properly, that means we have to audit those programs again, and it costs $25,000 to $50,000 every time that happens. So it's in everybody's interest in state government to make sure that when we find things, they correct it so it doesn't show up as a problem the next year. And then the third, and unfortunately, in this world, this is probably the most effective, is embarrassment. Suggesting that a program is not doing very well makes the people who run that program not feel very good. They want that not to be part of the narrative of their performance. And so sometimes it leads to people improving their performance because they don't want to be further embarrassed. In terms of the financial piece, which I said at the outset, the use of federal funds and then the state's books, those are done by contract. We hire a firm called Clifton Larson Allen. They're this big national auditing firm. They do that work for us under contract. It used to be done by KPMG, which is a firm more people probably are familiar with. And the group that we work with does a fantastic job. They are in state government offices almost every day of the year, working very closely with all the different agencies. On just to say a word about how we do on the financial front, I will just say that those of you who are unfamiliar with auditing lingo, material weaknesses are the worst thing that you can have when someone audits your books, and then significant deficiencies are kind of the next tier down. Those are growing in both regards right now in the state of Vermont for reasons that people can debate, but we have some suspicions about why those are. One is there have been such an avalanche of federal funds coming into the state, requiring standing up all sorts of new programs with roughly the same number of employees trying to manage that at all the different agencies, that I think they're just a little bit overwhelmed. But nonetheless, they're still required by the federal government to have good controls in place. So they're just overwhelmed. The second is staffing issues. So everybody knows how hard firms of all types are struggling to come up with employees to do the job that they need to do. State government's not immune to that. Unfortunately, one of the places that's becoming hardest is in the kind of business offices, accounting, the auditing functions, all of the things that are meant to keep internal controls to make sure dollars are being spent properly. It has been like a game of musical chairs in recent years. And there are positions that are very key that have been just sitting empty for very long periods of time. The Department of Finance and Management, which kind of oversees the use of all the dollars in state government, have said they've had positions just sitting there empty now for 6-9 months, not getting any qualified applicants. It doesn't help when you have that going on. There are some competence issues as a result of the staffing. People are being moved into positions for which they're just not really ready for or don't have the skill set. The Department of Labor, I will say, is probably a good example of that. They have had their struggles in a variety of ways, but the Department of Labor has people who are performing high-level financial functions who, frankly, it's unfair to them. They're more of data entry people, and they're being asked to do complex financial maneuvers. And as a result of all of this, the cost to do the auditing is going up. All right, that's the financial piece. Now I'm going to turn to what I think is more interesting, which is our performance audits. So I'm not going to do all of them. I'm just going to go through kind of a short list of the kind of more prominent and generally interesting ones. So our most recent audit that we did was of Burlington, Vermont's TIF district. We have a rule in my house, which is we're not allowed to talk about TIF after 10 p.m. Mostly because I am the one who is the perpetrator of such an injustice. In short, tax increment financing, which is used by about 10 communities in Vermont, is a financial tool that municipalities use to do infrastructure that they otherwise argue they cannot get money to do. So Burlington was really the lead in this statewide back in the 90s. And over the course of 25 plus years, it's become a very complicated octopus-like financial tool used to support everything from parking garages downtown, improvements down on the waterfront, and others. The legislature requires our office to audit these TIF districts, primarily because the money that the community gets to keep in order to finance these districts and these improvements would otherwise go to the state's education fund. So if you're from a small town that has no need for one of these tools to keep the money that would go to education, you're very jealous because you don't want your property taxes to be a penny higher than they need to be. And every time a new TIF district's created, they would argue that drains money from the education fund, meaning property taxes are a little bit higher than they would have to be. So our most recent audit of the Burlington TIF district found kind of a legacy of problems, many dozens of financial mistakes totaling more than $1.2 million, hundreds of thousands of dollars that needed to go to the state's education fund that had not been submitted as they were required to do. The city of Burlington then has a chance to respond to our audit. This is where there's always a little bit of polite combat in the public eye about whether our findings are supported by the auditee. In this case, they argued that over 15 or 20 years, there's been all sorts of staffing changes. The rules were complicated. They did everything they could to comply. But the long and short of it is that they agreed with almost every one of our findings. And so to their credit, they're trying to clean up their books. An interesting one I know that Debbie was very actively involved as a legislator around law enforcement training. So many people connect the modernization or evolution of law enforcement training to the protests in 2020 when George Floyd was murdered. The state of Vermont was already anticipating the need to update the way law enforcement officers are trained well before that, but even since then have made additional steps. So just a few examples. Body cameras were something that when the police academy was created, however many years ago, no one had body cameras. Well, the use of body cameras is actually a fairly complicated policy. When do officers need to have the cameras on to begin with? When do they need to be active? What data needs to be made available to someone in the public who wants to get access to it? Are they being trained for mental health interactions, which of course we all know is becoming an increasingly significant part of every officer's job? Racial bias training, something that we anticipated before the George Floyd murder, but is now required of every officer. So our audit basically said to the Criminal Justice Training Council, who were the ones who oversee all of the law enforcement training, we said, are they making sure that officers are getting the training that they are required by law to get? And does each law enforcement agency have all of the required policies that the legislature and the governor have said that they have to have? The long and short of it is that we really don't know. The record keeping at most law enforcement agencies, to say that it varies would be a fairly light touch. It ranges from very well-documented, sort of sophisticated record keeping. I would say the state police probably fall in that category, to some rather paper-based informal approaches of some of the smaller departments. The council that oversees all of this could not actually document that they were able to say that many law enforcement officers had the training that is required by law in order to go out and carry out law enforcement duties. In addition, departments are required to have a series of policies in place, including how they investigate allegations of wrongdoing, policies about how they're going to handle immigration cases, things like that. And the council that oversees all this is supposed to be making sure that those meet a minimally acceptable standard. And the short story is all they did was made sure that someone had one, but didn't actually check to make sure it was compliant. Some of this seems rather esoteric, right? Oh, well, it's just a paper keeping issue. But to give an example of where a policy may have real world implications, tasers are now carried by many law enforcement officers throughout the state. I don't know if they're here in Williston or not, Rick. Okay, they're not here, but many departments have tasers, or some officers have tasers. There is a model policy for taser use for law enforcement, and departments could just accept that, and that would be compliant with the law. However, some agencies either had stronger requirements for their officers that required a little bit more accountability and record keeping. So they made some tweaks, but others made strange changes to this model policy, including one. In the model policy, it says, do not tase a pregnant woman in the belly. Okay, seems fairly straightforward. One department took that out. Now, it might have been an accident. I mean, it was, we couldn't understand how that was possible because everything else was there. They took out one thing. They took out the prohibition on tasing a pregnant woman in the belly. However, now imagine that happens. An officer's out there, tases a pregnant woman loses the pregnancy. Well, if the person to whom that has occurred now goes to court, what is the officer's standard? What were they being, to what standard were they being held accountable? If the policy didn't say not to tase the person in that place, well, the officer really can't be the one that's put at fault. It's really the department. So there really are real world implications to some of these issues. Okay, as you'll see, I can talk for 5 minutes about my shoelace if I want. We just did an interesting one that bubbled up. So the auditor frequently gets emails from people in prison. Those emails often say, I have a complaint. Here's the complaint, right? I'm not being treated well. The diet isn't acceptable to me. You know, I'm being treated badly by, you know, a correctional officer, you name it. It runs the gamut. What we did was looked at whether the Department of Corrections system for keeping track of inmate grievances is efficient and effective. What we found is that they have a system which is computer-based, but completely not standardized is a well put. It the information that's put into the system, well, first of all, they don't even put all of the grievances into the system. Once it's in there, it can be missing almost all of the useful information. Many times the actual facility is not accurate when it's in the computer system. So there's allegations of staff misconduct at Southeast down in the Windsor area, but it's coded to the South Burlington facility. So you can't really keep track of how many of each kind of grievance there is at all the different facilities because it's unreliable. What the officers themselves scan a piece of paper into the system. However, the handwritten notes are illegible half the time. There's no keeping track of whether the grievance actually has gone through the process as required by the state law. There are cases of staff misconduct or alleged staff misconduct in these grievance forms, and the department and acknowledges they never even responded to them, but they can't say why. So if you think about going where in order to advance, so people can breeze through the submission of these things online, and by the end, they don't even know that they've missed half the important information. So question is, okay, they're behind bars, they've done something bad, why should the world care? Well, there's really a couple of reasons. So one, actually, you might have just seen in the news, there was a vote of no confidence by correctional officers at one prison about their superintendent or acting superintendent. right now, the corrections commissioner couldn't even tell you whether that facility had an extraordinary number of instances of alleged staff misconduct or of, complaints about treatment by management. He can't say whether people are getting responses to these kinds of grievances in real time. So why that matters is if inmates are unhappy, that means life is harder for the correctional officers. Correctional officers already have like an extremely horribly taxing job. There are too few of them. They are being forced to work overtime. Add in a more toxic environment because people don't feel like their outlet to have their problems resolved, that they feel like it's not fair or not even happening at all. That just makes life more difficult for the officers. All right. Another two recent ones we did. So the state received many billions of dollars from the federal government directly resulting from COVID. Our office looked at two specific programs to determine whether the money was being used as the federal government said it had to be. One was around grants to businesses who had suffered some kind of economic harm through COVID. And the other was money that went to healthcare providers along the same line. So the legislature granted out several $100 million to provide to small businesses predominantly who had lost revenue as a result of COVID. The federal government had also taxes. You weren't supposed to be able to get this money. The money was supposed to be for actual losses related to COVID. So the audit found that the agency that had been overseeing this had not even checked the department list, had not checked with the tax department to see if there were entities that had back taxes owed. And there were instances in both of those cases where people received hundreds of thousands to which they were not actually eligible. And they used fairly weak standards to determine whether a business had actually suffered the harm because of COVID. Now, on the one hand, would say, okay, a little bit of inefficiency in the interest of getting a lot of money out the door quick. And I think our office even in our audit said we understood that time was of the essence and there was a lot of pressure. But when we presented the Agency of Commerce the information to say, you can now go back now that you have a little time and make sure the money went to where it was supposed to, they said, we think if the money went out, then that's a good thing, period. And we're not really interested in going back in time. I don't mean, I'm probably being a little bit glib about it, but that was roughly the response. And I think we all might have some sympathy to that. I don't mean to say that there's not a legitimate case to be made that there's better uses of their time in going back and maybe finding some misuses of those dollars. But that's what we're there for, is to find out if we did it right. The other was for healthcare providers. This includes everything from the biggest hospitals down to single, person practices who do, whether it's dentistry or a whole number of other healthcare things. And we found that about $7 million went out in excess of what was actually allowed by federal law. That was, we think, a function of trying to stand up a program very quickly and get money out the door to shore up these healthcare providers. But in some cases, it was duplicate amounts of money. So the provider was getting double grants for the same exact lost dollar. But that's what we're there for, to point out these fun findings that make people happy. We helped the governor. I don't know if anyone in this room was a victim of this, but when people started getting 1099s that belonged to somebody else with social, did anyone go through that? Yeah. So many thousands of people received 1099s with other people's social security number and personally identifying information. The governor asked us if we would do an independent audit of that, which we did. And we found that the practices at the Department of Labor really were insufficient to make sure that people's personally identifiable information was being kept confidential. It actually dated back, we think, to one person's human error on an Excel spreadsheet that screwed the whole thing up. So it was an accident for sure. That definitely needs updating, and that's the Department of Labor is a whole nother work. Have me come back someday and provide alcohol. We can talk about that. And then before I turn to a couple of the issue reports we've done, we did one on dam safety. And this led to many puns. And when auditors work with puns, it's wild times. So the dam audit, as they called it, that the Agency of Natural Resources oversees a program called the Dam Safety Program. So there are hundreds and hundreds of dams all over the state. There are the little itty bitty ones, which you never see because they're like in someone's private property. And then there's the big ones that if they fail, people will die. The short story here was that what we found was that many of them haven't been inspected in a long time, including the ones that were in poor condition and that met us. That dams are basically cataloged as if it fails, people will die. If it fails, no one will die, but a lot of property damage will occur. And then if it fails, it's just a bummer, but no one will be hurt and no property will be damaged. The ones where either there'll be significant property loss or people losing their lives were included in the dams that had not been inspected in quite a while, that there was no plan to fix them. So we made a series of recommendations, and to their credit, the department said that they would step up their efforts, and they actually went to the governor and said, we need more money to do more corrective action on these dams that are in bad shape, and the legislature gave the money. So this was an instance just in the last 6 months or so that was a very positive outcome. And then I'll wrap in terms of the issues that we often try to draw legislative attention to. We had a very interesting one recently about the state's own employee healthcare plan. We determined that if the state of Vermont modeled its state employee health coverage after what the state of Montana has done, we could save about $17 million a year. So what the state of Montana did was said, we have state employees all throughout the state, and for the same exact medical procedure, we're paying wildly different prices. So if we have an employee in Burlington getting a colonoscopy, it might be whatever, $500, but the same state employee, if he or she gets the colonoscopy in Brattleboro, it might be $2,000, and we're paying whatever the price is. We never negotiate anything. Blue Cross isn't trying to address that for us. What Montana did was said, we're going to create kind of a reference price. We're going to say, okay, if half the hospitals can produce the good at this price, the service at this price, well, we know it can be done at that price, and we're not going to pay more than that anymore. So the presentation to the executive branch was less well received than we'd hoped, in part because it would mean tension between the administration and the largest healthcare providers. But the consequence of that is an ever-growing healthcare expense for the state employees. We presented it actually to the state employees last year, who were mildly interested, but at the time, I don't think saw why it was worth the effort. This year, they have a double-digit premium increase and have asked us to come back and speak to them again. So this is one of those instances where we're trying to provide a just the facts analysis, not after the fact, but in a kind of upfront, proactively. And government isn't always great about proactively addressing things. It usually waits till it has to go back and fix the thing afterwards. This is an instance where we could have gotten out front of this if it had been taken up earlier, but we do hope that there's some promise. And then lastly, two quick things. One is we did a complete calculation of all money that the state has spent in the last 5 or 6 years to address homelessness throughout the state. There was so much talk about the homelessness problem, and we wanted to just get our hands around it. And we were pretty stunned, actually. The number I'm using off the top of my head was in the ballpark of $450 million over the last 6 years. And while we talk about how big the homeless problem is in our communities and how it's been exacerbated by COVID, it's still not a huge number of human beings. I mean, every instance is bad, but we're talking historically, it was somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people at any given time in the entire state. And now we're in the 4,000-ish range, depending on how you calculate it. So we've spent $450 million, and the question of whether it has done much to reduce homelessness is a fair question. The problem has grown despite almost $500 million in the last 5 years, with the promise of spending much, much more in the next couple. And then finally, we had the state has its own performance reporting. So it tries to say, how well are we doing across all of these state agencies, everything from reducing the use of tobacco by young people to getting broadband deployed throughout the state. And in short, our report found that these annual performance reports were quite poor, would provide almost no useful info. We provided a number of suggestions. And just to give you an example of how problematic the state's performance reporting is, right now, if you go to the state website, it says that something on the order of 93% of Vermont residential buildings have access to state-of-the-art fiber optic broadband, which is a statement that I have not encountered a single human being who believes that statement to be true. And yet, if you go to the website, it says like A+, right? And so when you see things like that, you think, oh, well, that's ridiculous. And why would they do that? And we pointed out it would take the person whose job it is probably 30 seconds to fix that and be more accurate of reality, but he didn't change it. And so, but someone spent time producing that report, and across state government, people are populating these reports. So it actually takes staff time and money to do all those things. So it's not to demean those people, but just to say that the kinds of things we try to do is say, look, like if you're going to use your time on the report, make it useful so that anyone in this room could go to it and say, how are we really doing? And right now, it doesn't quite do that. So we do many other things, but those were a few what I think are highlights. I'll let you be the judge. And I'll leave it there. See if you have any questions.
Just so glad that there's people that like to do the stuff I don't like to do. I mean, kudos to all you guys, but boy, must be hard to stay chipper.
Yeah, yeah, chipper. Well, the thing is, like, if you're a curious person, it's a fun job, right? Because government does so many different things. And so some people will say, well, how do you guys choose what things you're going to audit? And there's no science to it other than we want it to be something that has a relatively high impact. We don't want to look at something that they spend $5,000 a year on and no one cares about, right? You want to do something that impacts a lot of people, and your imagination can really run wild in terms of what the potential topics are. And so it proves to be more fun doing the work than it might at first seem. When people hear audit, all right, I went to Boys State when I was high school. I was like a total nerd, and I don't have many memories of it, but one thing I remember is this: you had to run for like, did anyone here do Boys State or Girls State? All right. So everybody had to run for something, everything from like dog catcher to governor, and you had to get up and give a speech. And this one kid gets up and he was kind of like the class, like thick glasses. And he goes, there are 3 kinds of people in this world. He had a bit of a nasally voice, so my impersonation means nothing, but he's like, there are 3 kinds of people: those who were born to lead, those who were born to follow, and those who were born to audit. And he goes, I am the latter. I'm asking for your vote for auditor. So anyways, but our people bring that passion every day.
So in terms of Sherry's chipper factor.
Yeah.
Do you actually make changes? Do you convince organizations to make changes? Do they fix the things that aren't working?
Yeah, so every audit we do ends usually with recommendations to the agency that's being audited. And then sometimes if we found that the statutes aren't right, we will also include recommendations to the legislature to consider, either changing the statute. After we have a 1-year follow-up and a 3-year follow-up to every audit. And so a year later, we say, okay, here were the 5 recommendations. Agency, tell us whether you did them. And then we do it again 3 years for any of the outstanding ones. I would say that most of the recommendations are sort of enthusiastic, really great about it. They say, like the one I said about the DOC grievances, they were like, we totally agree. You're exactly right. We haven't been training our people. There's no accountability. Our computer system sucks. There's no person in the kind of main office who's responsible for making sure any of this stuff works. Our staff are frustrated. We want it to be fixed. No one's ever listened to us. So they're like, we'll do everything you've said. Thank you. the Criminal Justice Council had a new director. She's been there about 2 years now. When we started the audit, she said, can you expand your scope? Because I want you to find everything so I can start fresh because it's such a mess. You know, her predecessor say, we understand you're not here to try to make us look bad, but to get us to do a better job. And so tell us how to do a better job. Because I think they often feel that the audits are more editorial because a different agency to deal with a little bit.
One place that we don't have mandatory recommendations for help.
Okay.
When you have any place that state government is giving grants, especially very large organizations, whether they're nonprofit or hospitals or whatever they are, if they're given money, then they should be held accountable for that money. And so we need data in order to see if things are getting done that are supposed to be getting done. That's not always possible. Could you address that?
Yeah, it's so our audits are almost always after the fact, right? The money got spent. Did they spend it right? It's not, you're about to embark on a new program. We're gonna, be there with a magnifying glass every step of the way and make sure every single decision you make is right, because then you'd be a burden to the program. Broadband is a good example. We're doing a report right now about broadband. There is a huge amount of money that's about to go out the door for broadband in a very uncharted way. In fact, no state has ever spent the money quite how Vermont plans to do it. So there's a lot of risk involved. We find ourselves in the position of we can't judge whether it's going to work or not. We can just say, here are some things we are worried about as we see what you've got going on. We think that this will help make sure the money is used, in a better, more effective way.
Large hospital will get a ton of money.
Yeah.
And it'll be just in this kitty kind of thing, and they don't actually give good reports about how it's being used.
It's a good example of that is we did here's another thing I'm not allowed to talk about at night at home. I don't know how many of you know what an accountable care organization is, or One Care, which is the Vermont version of that. So our office did an audit of One Care with a basic question. Is it costing the state more to run One Care than it is producing in savings to the state? Fairly straightforward, right? You would only keep doing it if it was saving enough money. What did we find? We found that it was costing Vermont more to run it than it was able to say it was saving for the state. Now, people might have their own judgments about whether you give it 10 more years, 5 more years, but just as a fact, it was not producing the savings. The response generally from the healthcare industry was, oh, well, you have to think about this over the lifetime of these investments. Well, I can go to my primary care doctor tomorrow, and that would cost the state, whatever, $150 to suggest that they can draw some, whatever my life expectancy is. I hope it's more than one more day, but so let's say I got a couple decades left in my life. For them to say that we're going to do a calculus that somehow factors in the next 25 years would be a very difficult thing to do. So what they've done is tried, when I say them, what many advocates of the status quo for that particular program have said is, well, it's too complicated really to audit because it's because there's so many variables, things are mysterious. You can't treat us like everybody else. And now the truth is some things are complicated and there are lots of variables in terms of how people utilize healthcare. On the other hand, using that if I were running some other program that received money from the state, I'd be like, me too. Well, I about the long. They said really think that way, and that's sometimes we run into that resistance. And healthcare, because the dollars are so huge, is more vulnerable to that kind of thinking. The other is, and this is, I'm off topic a little bit on from the auditor's office, but hospital budgets, you'll see the Green Mountain Care Board, which oversees this, their general attitude is, we're not going to look under the hood. We just care about the top dollar number because it's too complicated underneath. And an example of this from my legislative, an example of this from my legislative days, maybe I'll end on this little story. One that was in the news. Many of you will remember when Fletcher Allen became University of Vermont Medical Center. And I forget how it came out, but there was a news story about how it was going to cost X number of millions just to do the name change, because you had to change like all the paperwork, the signage, huge amount of stuff had to be, everything from the lab coats, all the stuff needed to be changed. And it was like lots of millions of dollars. And so I sent 2 notes, one to the University of Vermont Medical Center team and one to the Green Mountain Care Board. The one to the University of Vermont Medical Center team said, did you let them know you're doing this name change that was going to cost all these millions? And the one to the Green Mountain Care Board was, did they tell you? And the University of Vermont Medical Center said, well, it was in one of the line items. But it wasn't identified, but it was in one of the line items. The Green Mountain Care Board said, it must have been in their administrative expense. So I followed up with both and said, well, does that mean next year those line items will be less the amount of the name change, since they're not going to change their name a second time? And both said, well, we just keep track of the growth rate of that line. And I thought, but that means you're effectively giving people growth on an expense that doesn't exist. Now, Jean knows that I will sometimes get accused of being a little picky about these things. I thought it was insane, but the world on that one took the insane route. But that's what's possible where the numbers are really big and it's hard for people to get in and look. So if I can end on one thing, it's that usually in the news, auditor says program, lots of problems. We don't put out press releases saying, 99 out of 100 were great, 1 was bad. It usually says programs doing okay job, but there's room for improvement. At its best, agencies say, we agree. We can do a little bit of tweaking and things will be better. At its worst, some agencies say, we're not changing what we do, we disagree. And that's the sweet spot of persuasion, financial pain, embarrassment.
Yeah. Great.
So thank you guys.
so much.
Thank you, Tim. And Sally, are you going to tell Tim what we do to
Sure,
thank
I
him,
will.
or do you
Yeah.
want me to?
I will, thanks.
Okay.
No problem.
Yeah.
So in honor of your speaking to us, we will make a donation to the mentoring program at Williston Central School.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Be sure it's being spent.
Yeah, I know. Seriously, I feel like you've already given me a gift by laughing at my meager attempts at audit humor.
I would love to have coffee with you sometime and talk about the healthcare system, because I'm a retired non-university physician, and I have lots of thoughts about. I'm not sure she heard.
I see a smile now. She knows my antics well.
There you go. Great.
Well, thank you
so
all.
much.
I hope okay.
It's great having you here.
Thank you.
Okay, so Sergeant at Arms, you are up. Oh, and